Welcome to Mind, Muscle, and Metabolism, the Jade Teta podcast. Here you get the in-depth science and practical tools needed to change your body, optimize your health, and elevate your mindset. I'm Dr. Jade Teta, and here is what I want you to know. You are different. You are as unique on the inside chemically as you are on the outside physically. And those differences matter. They matter because there is only one rule to achieving optimal health, fitness, and body change. That rule: do what works for you. My goal is to help you understand exactly how. I'm so excited you're here. Your transformation starts right now. Welcome to the podcast, guys. Today's episode is probably long overdue for a lot of us who are interested in research, whether you are an actual researcher or whether you are a clinician like myself, or whether you are a personal trainer or health and fitness professional, or a serious health and fitness enthusiast. This stuff is obviously very, very important. Now, let me get clear before I get into this discussion. Obviously, researchers, the PhDs who are on the ground in the universities doing these studies have light years more experience than I do in research. They're the ones that all of us are actually taking the information from. They're the ones that we owe the huge debt of gratitude to for their work. They are the true experts in this. And so I am not. What I am is a clinician, which means I work with people in clinical practice. And that has some profound differences. And I am a researcher also, but I'm more of an armchair researcher. So I read research all of the time. However, I am not schooled in it. It's not my primary education, and I do not do studies myself. And this is important because I want you to know who you're talking to first, because as you go down the line from the actual researchers to then clinician researchers, which I am not, to then clinicians who are armchair researchers, someone like me, to then individuals who are not scientists at all and have no real science background, who are just reading research themselves and then doing blogs on it. And then I would throw those people in the same sort of rubric as most journalists. I mean, some journalists absolutely do have a science background. Most do not. And so most people who are listening to this are going to be getting their, quote, science information from people who have no real science background at all and no real research background at all. And so when we talk about research, it's very different from a professional, a health professional, or a PhD who's actually doing the studies versus what other people call research. We kind of laugh at this when someone's like, I'm doing research, and they're doing Google searches and looking at blogs and things like that. That, to my mind, is not research from the perspective of what we're really talking about in this particular podcast. But it is hugely important, right? With all this talk of fake news and fake information and what's true and what's not true. And we have this situation where we have more information available to us than ever before. Now, one of the things that people often ask me, and I get accolades for, probably not really deserving of these accolades because it's not really my primary expertise, but I do get a lot of people saying, Jade, how do you decipher information? How do you get all this information? Well, one of the reasons that I have a lot of information is because one of the things that I do is I don't get my information from books, and I don't get my information from blogs, and I don't follow a whole lot of other professionals, actually. What I'm doing is I'm one of these people who reads research fairly constantly on PubMed. www.pubmed.com is an agency that you can actually go. It's a database where you can type in something like fasting and weight loss and have all the studies that have been done, the actual studies, not blogs, not books, not podcasts, not things like that, but actual research available to you, and then you can begin to read that research and decipher it for yourself. Now, in this podcast, I'm not going to go through how to read research. That would be sort of beyond the scope of this, but I do want to give people a general idea, especially people sort of below my expertise. Obviously, there's going to be people above my expertise who might be listening to this that might say, Jade's really not up on the latest with this and he's making mistakes here and there. But I do feel confident that I can educate those who are health and fitness professionals who don't have a science background, aren't clinicians, and don't read research. But that is also comes with the caveat that I am not a researcher. However, I do think that some of the best individuals at this work are the ones who translate information, translate science, translate studies into a digestible format for the lay public. And I do feel like that's one of my skill sets. And so let's get into this really quickly. The first thing we need to do is we need to understand what science is, because for some reason, my brother Keone, Dr. Jade Teta, and I talk about this all the time. For some reason, people do not understand science. And I guess it makes sense, because if you studied, maybe if your only science background is what you learned in school, and you're out there listening to, the blogosphere and the news organizations and fake news and all this kind of stuff, I can understand why you would have a misunderstanding of what science is. But let's understand first what exactly science is. It's hugely important, because science is not opinion. Science is not biased. Science is not dogmatic. Science is a process that checks against opinion, that checks against bias, that checks against dogma. It is a system that we developed to actually help us stop from being the typical humans who, yes, humans are biased. Humans are dogmatic. Scientists can be biased. Science is not. So let's define what science is. Probably the best place to start with science is the Socratic method. So many people know Socrates, many do not. But Socrates, and actually he was put to death for this in ancient Greece because it was a radical idea. He was of the mindset of, how do we know what is true? How can we possibly know what is true? We certainly can't look at consensus for what's true. We all know that's not the case. Just because a lot of people believe something doesn't mean it's true. Just because someone believes something very strongly does not believe it, make it true. So how do we get to truth? So Socrates developed this idea of what is now called the Socratic method, which is essentially to make a statement of what you believe is true, right? So, for example, we could say something like, all vegetarians are more healthy than meat eaters. Or we could say the reverse, all meat eaters are healthier than vegetarians, or vegetarians aren't healthy, or meat eaters aren't healthy. Any statement like that. So you take a statement like that, and you may have read on blogs and listened to a documentary or anything like that, and then you have to essentially go, well, is that true? Can I think of any exceptions to the rule? Have I ever met a vegetarian or a vegan or a meat eater that's healthy or unhealthy? Can I find exceptions to that rule? And what you'll find is absolutely you can find exceptions to that rule. Then you have to amend the statement and make the correction to the statement. So, for example, if you can find an exception to the statement that all vegetarians are healthy because you know or have seen somebody who's a vegetarian who is not healthy, then you have to amend the statement and say something like maybe all vegetarians are healthy except for a few, or most vegetarians are healthy. But then you have to refine that further too. Is that true? After you have looked at many, many vegetarians, and here's where science starts coming into the picture, because most of us can't go and talk to thousands and thousands of vegetarians and meat eaters and compare their health status. Researchers can, however. So then researchers come in and say, well, we've talked to thousands and thousands of vegetarians and vegans and meat eaters and not meat eaters, and we can see that there is no real statistically significant difference here, maybe. Or maybe it is. Maybe they say something like, most vegetarians are healthy, but they have certain issues that pop up, like B12 deficiencies and things like that. So new science and new questions start to emerge from this process. But if you follow this process all the way through, looking at all the vegetarians and meat eaters and all the studies, what you come to is you come to a statement that is more true, that essentially goes like this, There are people who are vegetarians who are healthy, and there are people who are vegetarians who are unhealthy. There are people who are meat eaters who are very healthy, and there are people who aren't meat eaters who are very healthy. The truth when it comes to nutrition is that there are many different approaches that can work for people health-wise, and we are still trying to figure out what that is. So that is the truest statement. And yes, there's some gray in there. Yes, there's some leeway. Yes, there's some unknown in there because truth is always emerging. And so science is not uncomfortable with unknowns. People are comfortable with unknowns, right? Are uncomfortable with unknowns. We don't like that. We want certainty. So we want the science to always give us the exact answer. And science doesn't, because science is an emerging truth. Now, some people say, well, science is an opinion, Jade, because certain scientists we know have been biased. One example might be the vaccine debacle where, vaccines, some of the data on vaccines being harmful was falsified, and those studies were sort of done wrong, and that particular scientist who did that research has been sort of disqualified or discredited from his profession. But as science continues and science is continuing to be done, we're starting to see that maybe we were wrong about that. And so science does eventually get to the truth, even though particular scientists who are human and are prone to bias and dogma may sometimes derail that science a little bit. So science is about consensus. Science happens over the long run, generations even. And oftentimes science is a little too slow for us. But science, just like the Socratic method, is a way to check against our biases. And the data never lie. A lot of people get frustrated with science because they say, well, I remember when we were being told fat was the problem. Now we're being told carbs are the problem. Now we're being told this or that's the problem. How come science never gets it right? Well, the truth of the matter is science is slowly getting it right. First, we were like, well, fat might be an issue globally. Then we were like, well, certain types of fat may be an issue. Well, maybe it's not fat at all. Maybe it's fat combined with some of these, inflammatory food products like high fat, high sugar, processed foods that are changing the gut bacteria and causing inflammatory situations in our body. See, we get to the truth faster and faster. Before you know it, you're kind of like, well, maybe fat wasn't the problem to begin with. Maybe we just needed more and more research to get us to more of what the truth is. Maybe the truth, closer to the truth, not the truth, is the fact that fat, certain types, combined with processed foods in a sedentary lifestyle cause X, Y, and Z issues. And so we have to keep a sense about us when we're looking at science. Science is not opinion. To think that is to misunderstand science. Opinion is self-perpetuating most times, right? Because we humans are subject to what's called confirmation bias. So when we have a strong opinion, what we will then do is we will seek out information that evaluates and bolsters that opinion and ignore or weigh more negatively anything that contradicts that particular opinion. This is called confirmation bias, and this is a natural delusional state of the human brain. But science checks against confirmation bias. That's the whole reason that we have science. So where opinion is self-perpetuating, science is self-correcting. One more thing here is funny because sometimes people say, but Jade, how come science always talks about theories? It's a theory. It may or may not be true. Well, that's a misunderstanding of how science uses the word theory. When we talk about the theory of gravity or the theory of relativity or the theory of evolution, in science, we don't give the theory moniker unless there have been thousands and thousands and thousands of corroborating studies to actually show us that, you know what? Yes, science is emerging. Yes, we can never know the truth completely, but this is so sound, and we've seen it over and over and over again, predictably, that we can say gravity is true and real. So we call gravity a theory. We can say the theory of relativity. We've seen that. We've seen evolution, the evidence of that time and time and time and time and time again. And so when science has a consensus, what we begin to say is this is theory. There's no disputing now that gravity is true. That's why we call it a theory. there's no real disputing, at least for serious scientists, that evolution is not true, right? Evolution is a theory because it's been studied up and down, sideways, a million different ways. It is largely now consensus. Same with the theory of relativity. So anytime you see theory in science, what that is essentially saying is we can be pretty damn sure this is about as close to truth as you can get because we've studied it so much. Pop it in real quick just to say thank you so much for your interest and support of the JadeTeta.com podcast. I am bringing back by popular demand the live Q&A calls I used to do back in the day where you can get on live with me, ask your question directly, and have me answer it in full. Questions about thyroid and adrenal health, autoimmune disease, any health condition, belly fat, muscle building, performance enhancement, you name it, we are going to cover it on the Q&A podcast. If you'd like to be on these live Q&A calls with me and speak to me directly, all you need to do is become a patron of the podcast. You can go to www.patreon.com/Jade Teta. That's www.patreon.com/Jade Teta. Become a patron of the podcast. I would greatly appreciate your support, and you'll be able to access me live to answer all your questions in depth. Thanks again for your support. See you on the podcast. So now what I want to do really quickly is to help you understand how I do my own research so you can begin to look at how to do these things. Here's what I do. If I have a question that I want to ask, I may do a brief Google search. But this is preliminary, and what I'm doing in this Google search is I'm looking at any news reports, any journalists, any people like that who have looked into this matter, right? So let's say back, several years ago before fasting was a big deal, maybe I'm looking at fasting, and so I do a Google search, and I look around and see what people are saying, especially looking for reputable sources, usually journalistic sources. Now, again, why would I go to journalistic sources and not blogs? Are journalistic sources perfect? No, they're not. But if you work for the New York Times or you work for CNN, at least, doesn't mean you're perfect, but at least there is a vetting process at play that you have peers and other people and a system of checks and balances that may not be perfect, but it's better than just some random blogger out there who has nobody checking them. So I may do that first, but normally I don't even go to blogs. Normally I'll go right to PubMed and I'll search fasting and weight loss or something like that. And I begin to look at the studies. Now, when you look at studies, what I want to point out to you is that there are many different types of studies. Let's say I come across a study on Ramadan fasting and the health benefits of Ramadan fasting in Muslim cultures, right? Well, this is a population study. I may find that during Ramadan, individuals have certain health benefits or certain health risks. And I may then assume, that means that the Ramadan fasting caused these health concerns and these health risks or caused these health benefits. And that may or may not be true because that is a population study. So when you see things like studies that showed 40-some thousand individuals were tracked over 20 years, and we found that there was an association between meat consumption and colon cancer, you cannot make a causative, definitive conclusion about that study because there are many other things that may happen. How do we know that people who eat meat don't also eat more sugar? How do we know that people who eat more meat don't also do less exercise? How do we know that people who eat more meat are not in more affluent countries or countries that have certain ways that they cook that meat? Maybe they fry that meat or other things. There's many, many different variables that could potentially tell us what is happening here. Now, is it useful information? Sure it is, but it doesn't tell us. It just says there might be a potential correlation here. The two are correlated, but they're not causative. Here's another example for you to drive this home. So let's say you're looking at a study that says they tracked 20,000 people over the course of 5 years and looked at their intake of synthetic sweeteners like aspartame and sucralose and things like that. And they found that there's a higher correlation with intake of these synthetic sweeteners and obesity, you could wrongly conclude that these sweeteners cause obesity, couldn't you? Or you could get closer to the truth and basically be like, more of these obese people, by nature of being obese, seek out low and no calorie sweeteners. And so you cannot use population studies to, tell you anything about causation. And this is where people get very, very confused. And so you have to understand the studies. Also, you can't tell much. Let's say that you have, a bioflavonoid, quercetin, that is a bioactive compound in onions, right? And you've read that it helps fight cancer. And you actually go and look at the studies, and you can't find any real studies other than test tube studies. In other words, they take cancer cells, they put them in a petri dish, they put quercetin in the petri dish with the cancer cells, and they find the cancer cells don't grow or die. Now, does this mean quercetin, if you eat quercetin, that is going to cause you to then not get cancer? We have no idea, right? Because that's in a test tube. It's very different in a body. For example, when you eat quercetin, your body makes many, many different metabolites around quercetin. Do we even know that the concentrations even get near the cancer cells? Do we know that quercetin is even in the bloodstream, or did it get broken down into other compounds? And in the case of quercetin, this is actually the case. It gets broken down into many, many different compounds. You may never see that artificial environment created with a petri dish and then concentrated quercetin. Therefore, we cannot say quercetin does anything for cancer at all unless we give 10 people with cancer quercetin and another 10 people with cancer no quercetin, and then follow them over a time period and then see, wow, the people who got the quercetin survived and the people who didn't get the quercetin didn't survive. That's known as a randomized controlled trial or study, and that is what we really want. Those are the studies we're looking for. We're not looking for test tube studies. They can tell us some information. We're not looking for animal studies. Sometimes animal studies can get us excited. For example, if we go, let's use the quercetin example again. Let's say, okay, interesting, the quercetin worked in the petri dish in vitro. That's what we call a test tube study, an in vitro study. It worked, seemed to kill the cancer cells. Now we tried it in mice and rabbits, and it seemed to also have an effect. We can get a little bit more excited about that because it is an animal study, and now it's in a real, in vivo, in life. Now it's actually working out in the real world in an animal model, but those animals aren't humans. And then we have to then study it in humans. So if we saw that quercetin in the petri dish blocked cancer cells and their growth, then we saw it helped in animals. What if we also saw that there were population studies showing an association with onion intake, which contains high amounts of quercetin, and lower cancer risk? Then we can start getting somewhat curious, but it still tells us almost nothing until we give this compound to real people in real life. One human group gets it, the next human group doesn't. They both have cancer, both groups. One group gets it, one group gets a placebo or is the control group, and then we see and compare. This is the way that science is done. So when you're evaluating someone saying research shows, you should be asking, well, what kind of research? Is it in vitro studies? Because that's not going to mean much to me. Is it animal studies? Because that's not human. Is it population studies? Because those don't tell us anything about causation. They just tell us correlation. Or is this a randomized controlled trial in humans? Right? Then we can start getting excited about this. And so when I start doing my research, what I do first is I go and look, because there are studies that are studies of studies, meaning that they will take many, many different studies on a particular topic and distill the state of the research down. These are called systematic review studies. And what they do is they'll take all the studies in one area. So if we're talking about this example of quercetin in onions, these review studies will take all the information, all the in vitro studies, the population studies, the randomized controlled trials of quercetin, and come up with a consensus statement about this and say, look, this study showed this study didn't show the same thing, but these 3 studies showed this one study showed this other thing over here. Based on the totality of the research we have right now, we may be able to say, and in science we're always talking about we may be able to say. We say may because we know that science is an emergent truth, and it takes years, decades, hundreds of years, generations before science is 100% clear. But these review studies are a great place to start. So when I'm researching a topic, I first go and see if there are any meta-analyses or systematic reviews. A meta-analysis and a systematic review. A meta-analysis is usually a review of randomized controlled trials, whereas a systematic review or review study usually includes population studies and randomized controlled trials and in vitro studies, etc. And so if you're looking at science and you really want to start understanding this and actually reading studies, you need to know how to put these things in context and set in hierarchy for yourself. Test tube in vitro studies are the lowest, right? Then we have sort of the animal studies. Then we have the randomized controlled trials, very good, but one trial in and of itself cannot tell us much. We need it to be repeated again and again and again. Systematic reviews start getting us closer to the truth. Meta-analyses really get us close. And then we can dig down into individual studies, try to understand the mechanisms, etc. And by the way, the worst of all possible studies is a case report. Your friend comes to you and says, I tried this diet, I got healthy. Those are the worst things. Or someone like me in clinical practice saying, I treated 10 people with, baking soda and it got rid of their XYZ. That stuff is the worst of all studies because it is one individual or a small group of individuals saying without any sort of randomized, controlled group that we are looking at to compare against. And so you have to understand these things. So I just want to do a quick blog on this, podcast on this particular topic because it's so huge. You don't want to be looking at science as opinion. It is not. Science is a process. To say that science is opinion is to misunderstand science. Science is not politics. Science is not scientists, individual scientists. Their work will be checked against the totality of the science. So you can have one scientist, even if they're falsifying all the data, you'll have another scientist come along and have to reproduce that study before we take it as truth. And they're not going to be able to do it. And this is why we need studies that corroborate each other from different places. This is also why you might be a little suspect if Coca-Cola is sponsoring a study on, sugar being beneficial. You might be a little suspect about that. But if you have other people doing all the studies and they're saying the same thing, then you can be like, oh, well, maybe Coca-Cola's right. So yes, you can look at this from a skeptical point of view. Who did the study? Who's behind it? Who are the scientists? What else is being shown? But you have to look at this from a total perspective and realize that science will win out in the end. Science is an emerging truth. It is a process that is divorced from individual scientific dogma or bias, that is divorced from the journalistic practices, that is divorced from everything else. It is something that helps as an emerging truth that is above that, and eventually it will get to the truth. The data do not lie. So if you're someone who's trying to be better about understanding where your information is coming from, realize that blogs, individual blogs by gurus, including people like myself writing a book, you read something by me, you have to basically be like, well, that's what Jade says and that's Jade's opinion, and it's his clinical experience, meaning this is what he's done that's worked for people, which absolutely can have some benefit, but is the science really in his favor or not? And a lot of times we have to say, what? We don't know, because that's the nature of science. And real quick, we also want to, when you're vetting science, it's also a great idea to understand the types of people that you are experts that you are talking to. And actually, this is a model I picked up from Brenda Burchard that I think is useful to talk about here, but there's several different types of experts. There are the researcher experts, the people who are in the trenches, doing the work, finding the information, right? Then there are role model experts. These are the people that are like, hey, look at my abs, I do this workout, you do it too, but have no real background. And then there are the results getter people who work with many, many people and get them results. So really, if you're looking for an expert to follow, because you can follow experts who will do a lot of this work for you if you know who to follow, you want someone who's all three, don't you? You want someone who is a practitioner themselves and, maybe is dealing with and working out with weights and eating right and experimenting on themselves. You want someone who works with lots and lots of people, thousands of people, hopefully. And that's where the internet comes in now, because it allows people to do that. I've worked with tens of thousands, actually hundreds of thousands of people have done my programs now, and a researcher. So I am, as well as many other people are, both a researcher, a results getter, and a role model. Those people are going to be probably better for you to follow and listen to compared to someone who's just one of those things. The other caveat that should trigger you off is that when you're listening to individuals talk, if they're not using words like may be true or I am somewhat certain or we could potentially see this emerge in a different direction later. People who understand science are always talking in tentative terms. They're not talking in absolutes and black and white. So when you hear someone doing black and white thinking and saying this is always true or this always does this, then you can pretty much be sure they don't understand science and are probably not very good at deciphering these things down for you. So for you, what you want to be doing is you want to be looking at the totality of the research, understanding that the worst possible study you can do is a case report or a small group of people saying something. Next, in vitro studies, things like that, you really want to look at those with a grain of salt. They're not real world. Animal studies, cool. You can get a little curious, but that's not humans. Human studies are best, especially human randomized to different groups, controlled. One group gets the treatment, one group does not, and then you see what happens. And then you can get review studies that basically look at many, many different types of studies all in one place on one topic, and then meta-analyses that essentially look at many, many different randomized control trials. Start, in my opinion, with the systematic reviews, the meta-analysis, get a good sense of what the research currently says on a particular topic, and then you can drill down into different mechanisms and areas of research that interest you. All right, guys, thanks so much for being on the podcast today. I hope this is helpful for you. It's something that comes up a lot, and I wanted to do one real quick because I know that science, information, fake news, all this stuff is out there, and I wanted to give you some real good, tangible information that you can use to decipher through this information. By the way, some of my favorite off-the-shelf organizations and individuals who do really good science, they are what I consider the researchers who I look up to and trust to give me some shortcut into finding the information. Examine.com, AlanAragon.com, Brad Schoenfeld. One of my favorites is Christian Finn. So find the ones that are good, that you know are reading the research, have a background, master's degree, PhD, that they understand how to decipher the research for you. Okay, guys, be well. See you on the next show. Quick break. Want to tell you about a resource you are definitely going to want to check out. I know not all of you are metabolic experts. You're not scientists. You're not biochemists. You don't necessarily know about hormones and endocrinology. So I created a free program for you, Metabolism School, to help you understand this stuff in more detail. If you would like the free course, you can go to drjade.com/metabolism-school, drjade.com/metabolism-school. Get the free Metabolism School resource. It'll teach you everything you need to know in depth and really get you caught up on the science.